Welcome to the 2020 Buckeye Book Fair. Thank you for joining us for this series of virtual events with Ohio authors and illustrators. The Buckeye Book Fair provides an annual celebration of literacy through author visits, educational programs for K through 12 students, and events for people of all ages. All of the books featured today and throughout the entire Buckeye Book Fair are available for purchase at buckeyebookfair.org. Should you have any questions for the presenters, please click on the Q&A button and type them in the window that appears, and they'll be answered later in the session. Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Buckeye Book Fair author-to-author panel session on The Writing Life. My name is Russell Cross, one of the board members for the book fair, and my role tonight is to introduce our panelists. Deborah Fleming is a professor of English at Ashland University, where she teaches courses in literature, creative writing and composition. Blending her own experiences with both scientific and literary research, her book, Resurrection of the Wild, Meditations on Ohio's Natural Landscape, discusses both natural and human histories as it focuses on the Allegheny Plateau and hill country in Ohio's eastern counties. Jen Hurt is an associate professor of creative writing and composition at Penn State University, who specializes in creative nonfiction essays and book-length memoirs. Her latest book, Hear Me, Ohio, is a collection of essays about leaving Ohio while always looking back at it. Hurt writes about her experiences with discovery, loss, connections, and a sense of place. As a founder of the nationally recognized publication River Teeth, a journal of nonfiction narrative, writer Joe Mackall is uniquely placed to talk about its history and influence. In his book, River Teeth, 20 Years of Creative Nonfiction, Joe celebrates 2 decades of writing by showcasing works by a selection of new and seasoned writers. Robert Miltner is an emeritus professor of English at Kent State and editor of the Raymond Carver Review. His book, Triptych, is a 3-book collection of poems that provide the reader with glimpses into love, self, and the rediscovery of one's muse through the timelessness of art, song, and poetry. Bonnie Proudfoot is a fiction writer, a poet, and a glass artist, and in her debut novel, Goshen Road, she paints an elegiac, unvarnished, and empathetic portrait of a working-class family's struggles in rural West Virginia over 2 decades. Scott Russell Saunders is an emeritus professor of English at Indiana University and the recipient of many literary awards. In his current offering, The Way of Imagination, he writes about how imagination can break the shell of the status quo, summon up objects that don't yet exist, lead to actions that no one has yet performed, and encourage wiser ways of living. And now let's go to our moderator for the evening, Scott Russell Saunders, who has the first question for our panelists.
We'll be talking about our new books. We'll be talking about aspects of the writer's life. And initially, I'm going to be putting a question to each of my fellow panelists, fellow writers here. And I'll just put Jen on alert. I'm going to start with Jen Hurt and ask her to tell us about her new collection of essays and anything else that's on her mind right now as a writer. Jen?
Thank you, Scott. So my new collection of essays, Hear Me, Ohio, is a collection of true stories, creative nonfiction, about all the places I have lived and visited and gone to since leaving Ohio in 1998. So I grew up in Valley City, Ohio, and worked a lot in Strongsville at Hertz Greenhouse, which is my family's greenhouse business. But after college, at Hiram College, I wanted to go to grad school and to keep learning the art of writing and that sort of thing. So I ended up living in Ames, Iowa for a few years, and then way out west and up north in Moscow, Idaho, at the University of Idaho for a few more years. And now I'm back in the east, sort of the mid-Atlantic. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania is where I live now. And so during all this time, I was writing both a book about Hertz Greenhouse and my connection to plants and to Ohio, but I was also working on all these other essays about things I was seeing elsewhere in Idaho, in Iowa. I did a writing residency in Kentucky for 2 months. So, you know, all these other regions of the world, and how growing up in Ohio taught me to think about them in the way I needed to think about them. So Hear Me Ohio kind of goes all around the country, but it's called Hear Me Ohio because I'm saying, you know, like Ohio needs to hear me, and we need to listen to adventures outside of Ohio as well. So I don't want to take too much time. So that's my book.
One of the striking sentences in the introduction to Jen's book is, I would not have written what I've written about Ohio if I hadn't left Ohio. So you're seeing your home place more clearly if you've spent time away from it. Now, Robert Miltner, you've written you've written in different genres. The one that is in your new book is prose poetry. Perhaps you could tell us about that, but also you had an interesting comment about moving from genre to genre at different phases in your writing career. Could you speak about your new book and also about the genre, how you choose the genre you're writing in?
Okay, first of all, my book is Orpheus and Echo. It's in a 3-book collection that's out from Etruscan Press, which is a remarkable endeavor to publish a trio of books in a single cover. And all 3 of our manuscripts were kind of experimental texts, which is, I think, why Etruscan Press went with it. I'm retelling the Orpheus myth, but I'm moving Orpheus through time and space. I go from classical Greek to, in the first section, classical Greece in the first section, to a recording studio in the middle section, and then it ends in Las Vegas and a variety of other places. I was drawn to this project because I'd had some personal loss in my life at the time, and I began thinking about how we process loss and how we process grief and what are our inspirations. And a couple of things coalesced for me. I saw Sarah Ruhl's play Eurydice, and her Orpheus was like a young Elvis, you know, the leather coat, the guitar, and I loved that image. I've played guitar since I was 15, so I was attracted to her Orpheus. I recorded an album of my poems with a jazz musician at my campus, which had a recording studio. So the middle section in the recording studio was practically memoir okay, of what it's like to be in that enclosed space and operating strictly on just what you can hear and what you can imagine around you. And then the last section is some time jumping that I went to because I had to go somewhere from there when I got out of the recording studio. It's a total hybrid of a book, which is kind of unusual for that kind of a hybrid in poetry. So prose poetry is a hybrid between logically prosed and poetry, which is to say, as Baudelaire described it in his invention, the paragraphs do, the sentence rhythms are really essential to the sound quality and the structure, whether it's a forward narrative or whether it's simultaneous or whether it's intentionally non-hierarchical. And yet every sentence also includes the central elements of poetry: sound, imagery, pacing, the buried ghosts of language that occur through tactful play with etymology. And I also took the typical square of prose poetry and I poked holes in it like mice had been eating at it, so that it looks like an ancient text. It looks like the Sappho fragments. And I threw all the even numbered lines. I threw a caesura in, you know, bring back the Anglo-Saxons. So the style was just a crazy, crazy form. But since everything else had been disrupted in it, I decided to do that. And I think it was a remarkable book for me. I'd never done anything quite like that. But it had to do with loss and some things that I lost in my life at that time. And that form just felt appropriate. I couldn't do it in verse. I tried it in standard prose, and I wasn't getting out of it what I was able to do in those short pieces.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to go to Bonnie Proudfoot next and ask her to tell us about her new novel, Goshen Road. Bonnie tells us she lives in Athens. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bonnie, but your novel's actually set in West Virginia, but you're living in the edge of Appalachia now, but your novel is set in deeper Appalachia. So could you tell us about your novel, Bonnie?
Sure, Scott. And I also wanted to say thanks to the Buckeye Book Fair and wonderful moderator Russell and Julia and Scott. So my novel is set in the very rural part of West Virginia. I actually just live a little bit across the Ohio River. So if you think about West Virginia, most of the time people think about coal mining and the economy based on that kind of extraction. But the area I lived in, northwestern West Virginia, was a timber harvesting area. And I actually lived there for quite a few years before I hopped over the river to Athens to go to Ohio University. And I got to really, I feel like, understand a bit about what the way the pacing of life and the people lived in connection with the environment. And we all know how beautiful it is. And in that Yeatsian way, terrible beauty too, because you pay a price if you stay there. And part of the price is the hardship of actually living in such a remote area. So it's a beautiful terrain. I was very drawn to the people and the culture. And even though I was an outsider, I married a fellow whose family was from that area. And that gave me, I think, a perspective on family life in very rural West Virginia. We're talking about a town, population 200, and a post office and a gas station where people make a living basically timber harvesting. And it's a very dangerous occupation.
And in the novel, you dramatize tensions between generations, folks who are more attached to the old ways in the region and younger folks who were perhaps seeking a different way. Could you tell about that?
So, setting's really important in a novel. And I think setting in a lot of ways drove this book. And not just setting in terms of place, but also time. And I started the book in 1967, and modernity had not really crept into West Virginia in a lot of ways. There wasn't really, practically no homes had telephones or even TVs at the time. And the radio was the main thing, KDKA came over the waves, or the baseball games from Pittsburgh. And other than that, though, church was the center of life. And there were a lot of really sort of traditional ways people could take a piece of land and get started in and have a productive life, trading and bartering. Even you could trade a horse for a shotgun, say. Well, of course, as modernity began to encroach, people began to look elsewhere to make a living, and life became harder and harder. And also with the advent of television in everybody's home, a lot of the traditions, like sitting around at night telling stories, or the medicine and herbs that people knew the healing quality of, or even midwifery, right? They fell by the wayside as modernity moved in. And so that disrupted, I think, family life and the connection to the land, and caused a lot of changes in rural West Virginia. So I got to have the benefit of seeing that. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And Joe Mackall, you're a writer yourself, especially of creative nonfiction, but also a teacher and an editor of a very distinguished journal devoted to narrative nonfiction, River Teeth. Could you tell us about the anthology? And also is it covering 20 years, right?
Yes.
I bet people would be interested to hear what changes, if any, you've seen in what passes for creative nonfiction over the course of those 2 decades.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, our book is, and my co-editor is Dan Lehman, who's also retired from Ashland University, but we work together for a long time. And we were both journalists, but all our degrees were in English right up through the PhD. And we really never saw any line between really great writing, whether it was reportage or essay or fiction, but we did decide to go with creative nonfiction for our journal. And we have our first draft of this book was 380,000 words. And you can imagine the folks that are publisher, the University of New Mexico Press, could not really embrace a 360,000 word book. So we did pare it down. It was very hard because, you know, you love everything that you publish, and to pick what we thought was the best while still being representative of the different kinds of folks who have sent us work over 20 years. It was, you know, it was tough going, but we got some terrific writers. We had one woman we published, Jessie Harriman. We published her 20 years ago when she was still a senior at West Virginia University. And we still love that place, her piece so much that we published it in this volume after all this time. And now she's a wonderful writer. She has some books out in the world. And I think she was the only undergraduate we ever published. But there's lots of major writers in the book. Chris Offutt and Andre Dubus III and Ted Kuzer, and just the whole Sam Pickering is one of my favorite quirky essayists. And there's a lot of terrific people. But again, this delay, I mean, getting things down to a manageable book, I think we have 110,000 words now, about 25 to 28 writers. But I would say it's pretty evenly essay, memoir, dominate, and then a little bit of reportage and even kind of a hybrid critical piece. I think what we've seen the most is, at first it was, I think we received mostly memoir early in our time. And it was very hard to get traditional essays, the kind that you write, Scott, and that I love. And I was trying, and then over the years we got more of those. And then we were hit hard with lyric essays when that became really popular. And, you know, we never really mattered what it was as long as it worked for us. And we didn't decide things by committee. Dan Lehman and I just trusted ourselves enough, or just because it was our journal, we would choose what we wanted. But if we loved it, and if we wanted to call the other guy in the middle of the night to tell him that we love this piece, that's pretty much how we picked our pieces over the 20 years. But I've learned a lot about, I know that women love to write about their mothers. I learned that over the last 20 years. Everybody wrote something about 9/11 for a while, and I don't think we published any of them. Now we're getting pandemic pieces, as you can imagine. But that's pretty much what we've done. And we just thought after 20 years, I mean, a lot of literary journals don't even last 20 years. So we thought it was time for a book, and University of New Mexico Press was good enough to be open to it. And we're pretty happy with it.
All right, thank you. And the last of our panelists I'm coming to is Deborah Fleming. And her book is the one that I read first, because I read it in galleys, I guess, or in manuscript to write a blurb for it. One of the practices of any working writer. And Deborah, I wonder if you could tell us about Resurrection of the Wild, both the region and why you wanted to write about it, and also the theme of restoration. That's such a powerful part of the book.
Well, I came to essay writing a little bit late. Like the others, I was a poet and a fiction writer. And first a scholar. But because of where I live, I found it interesting. I thought it might be interesting to write some essays. And then after I had those essays written, I thought maybe this might make a book. To answer your question, the very first essay called Resurrection of the Wild, was compiled, as I say in the essay, because several times in my life when people ask me where I'm from and I say Ohio, I get this incredible sneer. And so I decided to see if I could compile some of the better parts of the state, describe the better parts of the state. I grew up in Jefferson County and saw some of the worst. Well, Jefferson County is the most strip mine county in the state, and sort of watched the strip mines grow back into useful land. I know it's hard to believe. Sometimes without reclamation, what we call reclamation now. And so I decided to find out how that happened, and realized that if the land and the soil is strong enough, it's possible to be reclaimed, and or to reclaim itself in some ways. I also used to spend a lot of time hiking in southern Ohio, in the Zaleski State Park, which is near the Wayne National Forest. It's inside the Wayne National Forest, and stop and look at the different places that were marked, and realized that the hiking trail was an old Indian trail, and then it became a road, and now it's a trail again. And I should say Native American trails were made by following the animals they hunted. And so I marveled at the fact that the land could recover and could have several different lifetimes, you might say. And so I wrote that first essay. That was the first one I wrote. I live near Malabar Farm and the Mohegan State Park, and the history of those two places fascinated me. And raised some horses, and found that perhaps writing about them might be of interest. I'm sorry, am I answering the question?
Well, you're characterizing a number of the essays and a number of the themes and kinds of subject matter, and I'm sure listeners and viewers get a taste of the book from that description. Well,
go ahead.
Just to pick up on what you've been saying, Deborah, something, I believe it was Bonnie who brought it up earlier in our conversation. All of us have an interest in nature, in landscape, in geography, in the earth. That might sound, well, of course, everybody's interested in the earth, but that's not actually true of most contemporary literature. Most contemporary literature, a friend of mine, a writer named Gary Nabhan, says most contemporary literature is urban dysfunctional literature. It's about the breakup of relationships in coffee shops and
yes,
affairs in large urban centers. But all of us, to one degree or another, all of us gathered in this particular group, pay a lot of attention to place, including places like Ohio that many of our fellow Americans think of as non-places. I live in Indiana now, southern Indiana, which is also very handsome hill country, like the area around Athens, for example, Athens, Ohio. Yeah. But most people who've never been to Indiana or have only flown over it think of it as a place without nature. Well, there's no place on earth without nature. Not even Manhattan is without nature. So I wonder, this could be for anybody, how has nature, and however you want to characterize that, landscape, geography, how has nature figured in your writing? And maybe you could give us it might be your most recent book, or it might be some earlier piece of writing you've done. How has nature been important to you as a writer?
So if I can take that one first. So for me, growing up in the greenhouse, in Hurd's greenhouse in Ohio, I sort of always knew the names of the plants in the greenhouse. And then once I started like hiking around Ohio, and just like hanging out in the wilderness by myself quite a bit, I was always like, well, what's the name of that plant? What's the name of that tree? What's the name of this little creek or this river and that sort of thing? And I know, Scott, you've written a lot about this. Like, it's very important to know the name of a thing in order to really, really understand it. And so for me, the connection with like place and writing and that sort of thing is just, you start with these sort of like these questions, like, what is this tree I see all over Ohio? What do I call it? What is its what's the species name? That sort of thing. And then, I take that with me, obviously, anywhere I go, whether I'm in the St. Joe National Forest of Idaho, or I'm at Bernheim Arboretum in Kentucky. You've got this grounding, this foundation in knowing the names of things. And Ohio is, it's this fairly diverse place. There's a lot of things to learn about nature in Ohio. And so I keep that, I keep that grounding with me quite a bit, that rural nature of Ohio. And I'm always so surprised when I teach nature writing to my college students. They start the first day of class, many of them not knowing the names of trees or flowers or anything. And they pick it up so quickly. I give them an assignment, to identify this particular tree all the way down to the species, that sort of thing. And then they get hooked on it. And I think that's part of writing is you start with these sort of like factual things about nature, and then you can take you into the land of imagination, the metaphysical, the truth beneath the truth, is what I kind of go for in nature writing. And Bonnie, I can see you nodding. Maybe you can relate to that too, and probably Deborah as well.
Other connections to nature in your writing?
So I'll jump in a little bit. The people that I write about, my characters in my fiction, live in such a rural place that their exposure to nature is unlike anything that when I was growing up, that I even experienced. If it rained day after day after day, the wells had more water, and you could water all the gardens and the plants from the wells, and you could feed all the livestock. If it didn't rain for months on end, you watched the ground parch and crack, and you worried about the crops and where were you going to get the water for your crops. The ground underfoot, of course, feels different day by day, depending on the humidity of the soil and how much the wind picks up, or what the way the weather changes. And I really got to know that the way my neighbors lived with the cycles, deer hunting in the fall, and whether or not they could get grouse or rabbit, because the patterns that the animals live in connect to their food supply still. It's kind of a critical connection. So and even the types of hay their horses eat, there's so many different types of hay, and all the weather conditions kind of impact that. So I learned more about nature than I ever knew, just living in a very rural part of West Virginia, and observing some of the traditions, some of it connected to superstition, and the superstitions are wonderful. And whatever I sort of heard people say, I picked up and put into my book, so that my characters are as kind of realistic as they could be. Charming things like a snake can charm you, and I'd never heard anybody say that before. Or to tell if a melon is ripe, you take a broom straw and put it over the melon, and if the broom straw bends, then you know that the melon's ready to eat. And just even the patterns of gardening, covering tomatoes, knowing when the last frost was going to come. Those intimate connections, and really it's time-honored tradition that families are built around it, and some of those are vanishing, like I said.
All right, thank you. Anybody else want to comment on nature in your writing, or I'll move on to a different question? What about combining, most of us are teachers or have been teachers at different times in our career. Did your teaching, or does your teaching compete with your writing? Does it nourish your writing? What's the relationship between your teaching and your writing? Anybody want to take
yes. I would say yes to both questions. I'll take that, and then I'll quickly, and then I retired 2 years ago, a little early, but I thought it was the right time. And I loved my students very much, and I loved teaching, and I loved reading their stuff, their work over the years. I think sometimes just the time and energy you poured into it seemed to almost come from the same place as the writing. And that sometimes could be a problem, but other times you just leave there so inspired by what they're able to do and how uncynical they are, and how fresh-faced they could still meet the world, that often it was inspiring, and it fed into my writing. I mean, I didn't write about them, but it just kept me on the right side of things. And I'm not teaching right now, but and I do have more time to write, which I love. But there was a part of me that I didn't even realize how much was being fed by teaching. It fed me as a writer and as a human being.
Mhm. Robert, you look like you were going to say something about teaching and writing. Am I right?
Me?
Yes.
Me? Oh, you know what I was going to say? I was going to point out that Joe is a winner of the teaching award at Ashland University, the most prestigious award that they give, I think. So I think he's the right one to talk about the give and take. What I like to do is share what I've learned from writing and publishing with the students, because I feel that I can, answer those questions that they have. And generally, I just tell them to keep it up, don't give up. If you give up, you won't make it. And it sometimes takes a tremendous amount of perseverance to get even that first essay or poem or story published.
Maybe we should come back in a moment to that question of what keeps you writing, because there are a lot of reasons. Every writer knows there are a lot of reasons to quit writing. But what keeps you writing? That's a question each of us might have an answer to. But again, Robert, I want to make sure. I thought I saw you were going to say something about teaching and writing. Was that?
I think the teaching life is one that is really enriching for us as writers. It was enriching for me because I had an academic writing that I did. I edited a journal. I did creative writing, and so I think that the fact that I was moving back and forth between scholarly nonfiction and creative writing, poetry primarily, the ability to move between those set me up for moving from verse poetry to prose poetry to fiction to nonfiction. And so I think that world and the way that those things can feed off of each other and influence each other without being competitive is really healthy. I think one of the most remarkable things that I gained from teaching, particularly in creative writing classes, is I was very active with engaging my students in artistic collaboration. I did projects with painters and printmakers and sculptors and jazz ensembles and dancers, and taking them to museums. It's surprising how many students have never been to a museum. And can I bring my friend? Of course you can bring your friend, bring your family. You just can't bring your dog, but those interactions where we would talk about art and influence across those things, not only created ways to communicate the power of art between us and build communities outside of the writing community in the universities with these other artistic blocks. It's had a huge impact on me in terms of particularly the influence of the prompts that visual art does and what that does to my writing, particularly poetry, the language, the color, the nuance, foreground, background, all the artistic viewpoint, which then tumbles onto the page. It's such a rich environment. And I don't know where I'm going to stop on this, except I think I'll just stop here because I'm out on one of those places where I don't know to loop back. Who's next?
So again, to remind folks about the name of our session, The Writing Life, I resist that phrase a little bit, because writing is something that comes out of our lives, and lives include, for most of us, how we earn a living, and many of us have earned a living as teachers or as journalists, but most of us probably have families, and our writing is shaped by family life. It can also be, writing can be influenced by what's going on in the world. In fact, it would be kind of strange if it weren't in some degree influenced by things going on in the world, politics. And right now, if one were writing a new book, all of our books were completed and several were published before the pandemic. But whatever writing we're doing now is probably influenced to some degree by this tragedy that's unfolding in our country and around the world. So many illnesses and so many deaths. So I wonder if people, we have just a few more minutes before we will take questions from the folks who are tuned in to listen and watch. I wonder if you would talk about things in your life, personal life, family life, public life, politics, things going on in the world, things in your life that have influenced your writing, that the influence maybe what you chose to write or how you approached your writing, just influences from outside the page.
Well, I can start briefly and then I'll pass it off to somebody else. I have a collection of essays coming out in the spring, but I've been feeling the weight of generations. I talked about this earlier, those who have come before us and those coming after. And it's because we kind of accidentally live on this place on the lake where now there's 4 generations of us on this little lake. And I have my daughter and her husband and 2 of my granddaughters. And then my dad lives across the lake. He's 89. He's been happily married twice, but both my mother and his wife, his second wife, died. And he is just like a force of nature. He just keeps going and wakes up every day and deems it a beautiful morning. And I really don't have that characteristic. It must skip a generation or something. But suddenly I just felt like, oh my God, we have 4 generations here. And he's got his walls covered with pictures of people from his family that I never met, but the stories are ever present all the time. And how to live with loss in particular, like what Robert was talking about earlier. And I found something incredible about this pandemic when it hit, because I did want to, it kind of slammed into the side of anything anybody was writing. But I remembered that my grandparents on both sides, who were in their late teens or early 20s during the 1918 pandemic, never talked about it to us, never told stories. They told endless stories about the Depression, endless stories about World War II, no stories about the pandemic. At first, I found comfort in that maybe it wasn't this life-altering moment for them that it seemed like to us. But then later on, I was thinking, I really wish we had some stories to help us get through now. And those things kind of just all combine into the way I'm living now and the things I feel that I have to write about. And stories are everything. Leslie Marmon Silko has this great quote about, don't ever underestimate stories. They're everything. We just need to hang on to them. And that's where I feel I am right now as a writer and as a person.
Okay, other influences on your writing from other folks?
I'll jump in for a second here, Scott. While I was working on my book, and I was teaching also, I taught at Hockin College in Nelsonville, Ohio for a very long time, close to 20 years. Hillbilly Elegy came out, and it took me quite a long time to write this book. I started it as a series, 2 short stories. My book is Linked Narratives, and I kept writing stories and it turned into a novel. but I began to think that there was a call for me to complete this book. It really felt like I knew the people that I was writing about, and I even maybe knew some of the people that J.D. Vance wrote about. They were my students at Hockin College, and they were even, sort of the forebears or distant cousins of some of the people who migrated to Middletown, Ohio from Kentucky, but in my character's case, West Virginia. And I felt like I knew other things about these characters, more so than what was just portrayed in Vance's book. And that there's a spiritual core in my characters. There's integrity in the characters in a way that he doesn't develop that. There's a connection to landscape and a pride in who you are and a pride in family that are maybe strains that run through my book. And if I could say anything about outside influences, it's sort of, I got kind of a kick in the butt when that book came out to finish. I really need to finish this novel of mine. So that was an interesting cultural influence on me.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Bonnie, but it sounds to me that what you're saying is you realized that you knew a deeper truth, or at least a different truth about people than this much ballyhooed book that had gotten so much attention.
Yeah, and I thought so. The word hillbilly is a very sort of kind of touchy word to use, and in Vance's book, it looms large. It sort of looms large for the whole region, and there's quite a few people that I know who felt like that's not me. There's and yet my folks, my characters, are very grounded in the land, in rural country life and in the land, right? So I don't know, I wanted to write a book that my neighbors, ex-neighbors, would not have been embarrassed about reading and sharing with their friends and family, and my students as well.
All right. Other folks want to talk about influences on your writing?
Yeah,
Jen?
so I agree with what everybody's been saying so far. So I'll add in sort of a very practical and sort of hands-on influence on my writing, which is walking my dog, and and just walking dogs in general. I volunteer at the Humane Society where I walk dogs. Dogs show me stories. They show me things. We come across interesting things. I have interactions with people that start with a conversation about the dog that I'm walking at the moment, or how the dog reacts to them. So when my students ask me a lot, what do you do when you have writer's block? And I say, I go walk my dog. We'll go out and we're going to go around the block, and something is going to happen, and maybe I'll write about it and maybe I won't, but every walk is a narrative. Every walk is a story, and my dog he's a partner with me in that story. He's a character, in that story with me, and I'm thinking about what he's thinking, and I probably get way too much into my dog's mind. But growing up in Ohio, I grew up in rural Ohio in Valley City. There were neighbors close by, but not really. So I spent a lot of time just walking in the woods with my German Shepherd, with my cats, with my horses. We'd walk around the field. And so there, the ways that the animals interact with their world, and then that cross section with our world, is very much an influence on my writing life. And when my first dog died, my first dog I had as an adult, when he died, I couldn't write. It was not only the grief, but it was that I didn't have that, that partner, that character to go with me on that walk. And I was like, I got to get another dog if I'm going to keep writing. So it's interesting to think about the animals in our lives. And it doesn't have to be a pet. It can be a bird that visits your backyard every day. It can be a raccoon that gets into your trash or something like that. But the sort of the lives of these animals is very much an influence on my writing.
All right, thank you. I'm looking at the clock here, and I'm going to wait for guidance to see whether we have a sampling of questions which listeners and viewers might have submitted. If they haven't, or haven't submitted enough, we certainly have other things we can talk about.
Scott?
I was just going to say, so I'm
You want
checking
to talk
the
about your
questions
book?
here. And I was just going to say, I'm checking the questions here. Just to remind people who are watching, feel free to add something in there. But I was just going to say the same thing as Joe there. Everybody's had a little bit of a chat about their book. Probably be good for Scott to tell us a little bit about his now.
Okay.
Thank you, Russell.
Okay. Any other influences on your writing? Politics?
Well, I could talk. Sorry.
Yes, go ahead, Deborah.
People have mentioned influence of their family. I'm currently writing a novel based on my great grandmother who was married to a rancher in Texas. My other two novels, one coming out in January and one that was out in 2014, having to do with the Vietnam War, which was going on when I was growing up and also when I was in college. And also the events of 1970 on the college campuses in the spring. So I had to put that into, also, everyone is talking about the influence of nature. My third book of poetry is coming out in January, and that's a very environmentalist book, environmentalist poetry, trying not to be too terribly didactic about it, but I have that kind of influence, I'd say.
Any other?
Oh, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
I've pretty much talked about it. Growing
Right.
up in Jefferson County, where there were so many strip mines, really inspired me to write about nature and the fact that even when it's desecrated, it's possible to come back.
The earth is bigger, older, and ultimately wiser than we are. We've certainly collectively as a species done tremendous damage, driven many species to extinction, and dramatically reduced the populations of other species. But there still is this creative vigor in the earth and its creatures, and it's going to continue to generate new life. It may be different life, and it may or may not include human life, but the life of the earth is much larger and much more powerful than we are as a species, even with all of our technology. I'll just say a little bit about my own writing. My new book is a book of essays called The Way of Imagination. And I'm interested in imagination as a very distinctive, and if you think about it for a moment, an uncanny power. Because humans, perhaps uniquely among animals, we can't be sure, but I have a hunch that we're the only animal that can actually summon up in our minds things that are not present to our senses, things that we've never encountered before, things that we're not presently looking at or touching. We can envision things, objects, structures, patterns, works of art, and social possibilities. An end of slavery or a society without slavery had to be imagined before people could work towards it. A society in which women could own property, could vote, could sue for divorce if they were abused or simply if they chose to. That had to be imagined before it could be worked towards. Every scientific discovery is a product of imagination reaching into new possibilities. And the other profoundly important role that imagination plays, not just in art, not just in science, not just in social reform, is imagination is what enables us to feel our way into the lives of people and creatures that are different from ourselves. And unless we do that imagining, unless we imagine what life might be like for that homeless veteran who's sleeping under layers of cardboard on the sidewalk, or that person whose dark skin makes him a target for police, unless we can imagine what it might be like to be a person quite different from ourselves, we're not going to be able to care for that person quite different from ourselves. So imagination, which is the theme of this new book, seems to me a power which clearly can be used for wicked deeds. Hackers use imagination. Con artists use imagination. So it's not an inherently benign power, but it's an extraordinary power. I see we have a question, and I want to hear what that is and give anybody who wants to respond the chance to do so. Russell, you're going to let us know about the question?
Absolutely, and I was just having to hit the right button to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm as technologically challenged at this time of the day as anybody else, I think. So we have one question from folks watching us on YouTube here. And the question is, we know that you like to write, but can you tell us what you like to read?
Oh,
That's to everyone.
Yes. What do you like to read? Have a go at that.
well,
Joe mentioned two
I like
novels.
to read.
Juicy one.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Deborah. I'm sorry.
I like to read poetry, especially W.B. Yeats. I like to read Wendell Berry's nonfiction and Scott Russell Sanders' nonfiction. I'm just reading a book now by a farmer from California called Walking the Flatlands. His name is Mike Madison, and he's got a very interesting perspective on living in the Great Valley, where he owns a farm of only 20 acres and actually makes a living off of it, surrounded by great big fields owned by the big agribusiness and so on. So it's quite fascinating. Well, I like to read a lot of different kinds of things. So I'll let somebody else chime in here.
Joe, you were going to say something about reading?
No, I just said it's a very juicy topic for us. But I read an awful lot of nonfiction. I love history. I read a lot of history. I was having kind of a tough time with some contemporary novels because I wanted people to have jobs. I wanted people to work in the novels and to care about something other than their career and their relationships. But then I found a couple I mentioned earlier, and it goes in waves. But sometimes, and if I'm right in the middle of writing something that's some nonfiction piece, I generally try to read something of fiction. But I've got my all-time favorite writers, but I'll let other people jump in now.
Okay. Jen, or
I read a lot of poetry, and I write poetry these days more than ever. I also write short stories, and I read a lot of short stories, and I tend to read a lot of Appalachian fiction. And I have some favorite writers, Robert Geip and Chris Holbrook and folks like that who's write about the region.
I have been really influenced by Cormac McCarthy's fiction, and more specifically his sentence level writing style. So sometimes when I'm stuck on a true story in an essay, I'll just open up Part of the Road and just start reading about like the end of the world, basically. So fan of Cormac McCarthy, also a fan of Virginia Woolf. I try to reread To the Lighthouse every year. And it's that interiority, the way she takes her time with time in her works. I have recently discovered within the last 5 years, I don't know how to describe them, but Eileen Miles, who is a poet, performance poet, punk poet, memoirist, ran for president, like activist. but mostly Eileen's poetry is something that I've been going to. And specifically the role of like social justice in her poems is kind of speaking to me in a big way lately.
Robert?
Reading for me, there was always the reading I did because I was teaching it, right? So
Yes.
there's that whole body of reading. Then there's that comfort food of reading all these books that I've read before, or they're books that I want just for the pleasure reading. Then there's the reading I do as a writer, and I'm particularly interested in where people are pushing boundaries or hybridizing or moving things together, or like, the sentence level in Cormac McCarthy, what poets do with language, which is so different. I love the prose poem because of its very experimental nature. I'm just intrigued with books that show me something that inspires me to want to write, or when I go back to my own work, I see something where what I read can make me change something and bring something new into it. So it's like all books that I'm not teaching or reading for pleasure, or some kind of palette that I go through looking for things that I can bring into my own work.
I also read poetry, and my wife and I have a practice of reading poetry aloud to one another after meals.
Nice.
And I read a lot of essays,
Mm-hmm.
especially essays that are grounded in the earth. I'm interested in philosophy. Well, more specifically, I'm interested in ethics and how people explain their own values and what they ground their values on, where they come from, and how those values shape, or at least are intended to shape, their lives and their vision of a good society. So those are among the kinds of reading I do. I read some fiction. We have a little family book club, and we read exclusively novels in that. And so I learn about interesting writers from my son for books he proposes, or from my daughter, or from my wife, who also propose interesting novels. But I tend to read more nonfiction than fiction, and I tend to read more essays than poetry, but I do read a lot of poetry. So that's just a sampling of the kinds of things I read. I think we are nearing the end of our time together, and I'm wondering if any of you want to make a last brief comment for the folks who've tuned in. Anything about how writing and reading matter to you?
It occurs to me that the endeavor of writing and reading too, it is our best way to come in contact with that imagination that you were talking about, Scott. For me anyway, that the more I read, the more my sense of what's possible as the palette of thought expands, of course, and I think we probably are all saying that. And also, the more I write, the more I open myself to that kind of imagination. I was so glad you brought that up.
Well,
all the best. Okay. All the best writers are great readers as well.
Well, I'm pleased to recommend the books by all these folks here. Not necessarily mine, but the other folks. Those are the ones I can endorse and recommend. But also just the practice of reading. We live in a society that's very visual, we know that, and a society that fragments our attention, that is based on distraction, on hurling sensations and shiny things in front of us to grab our attention, but not to invite us to think, not to invite us to reflect deeply, not to invite us to imagine, but actually to invite us to jump to the next sensation. So reading and also the practice of writing are ways of being more deeply reflective about our lives and about the world. So I hope the folks watching this, listening to this, who may also see the recording of this, support the Buckeye Book Fair, both in its virtual version, as it is this year, and also when it's going to be in its incarnate, in-person version. Let's hope that's going to be possible a year from now. So thanks to my fellow panelists. Best wishes for your writing and for your living.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Scott.
Folks,
Thank you.
And on behalf of the Buckeye Book Fair, I'd also like to thank all the panelists for participating in this fascinating discussion. Also, a special thank you to Scott for being such an excellent moderator. And a thank you to all our generous sponsors who are supporting this annual Ohio event. So as Scott said, please visit our website, buckeyebookfair.org. You'll see other events that are coming up, and you can also buy signed copies of any of the books from our presenters. So finally, thank you all for watching, and
Thank you,
have a
Russell.
great evening.